Hello, I am Nikki Magruder, Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for MU Healthcare. I served previously as Director of the Inclusive Impact Institute, and I'm a proud member of the Counsel Collective.
My name is Melita Walker, and I am currently the principal at West Middle School with the Columbia Public Schools. And I am also one of the co-founders of BOLD, an initiative that supports Black and Brown girls in the area, and a proud member of the Counsel Collective.
My name is Crystal Graves Yazaja. I am the owner of Crystal L. Hair and Makeup and the founder of an online education program called All Hair Academy, and a proud member of the Counsel Collective.
I am Adonica Coleman. I am the owner of A2D Events here in town, and I am also a board member of the Bold Academy, as well as some other local organizations, and a proud member of the Counsel Collective.
Hi, I'm Erica Neville. I'm currently the principal of Douglas High School. I'm vice president of the board of the United Way, and among other things, and the proud mother of 3 children. And I am a member of the wonderful Counsel Collective.
All right, ladies. So we got those formal intros out of the way. Now we want to welcome everybody to our session. Don't check the box, do the work. And our session is about diversity, equity, and inclusion. DEI is not seasonal, on trend, or the hot topic of the week or month or year. There is no checklist to complete. The work is important, intentional, and absolutely imperative to the success of building a truly inclusive environment. It's not easy work, but it is necessary. So thank you for joining us for this open, honest conversation that we are about to engage in. So ladies, I think that at least 3 or 4 of us were at an event recently, a few months back, where it was announced that DEI was a hot topic. It had been a hot topic for this year. And I remember all of us exchanging a look across the table and discussing that for some time after that event, that the thought and the words that went out that day were that DEI was a hot topic. So I just want to jump in right there because it seems like a good place to start as any. DEI is a hot topic. Somebody?
It is not. It's a necessary conversation that needs to continue to be had, and it has to extend beyond talk. There are actions, intentional actions, there's work that has to be done. But I do remember hearing that and thinking, like, this isn't just a one-off thought. Like, people really do believe that this is the hot topic. This is what we're talking about. And I think we saw a perfect example of that in this past year with the killing of George Floyd last May. And then what we saw as everyone, what it seemed like being in this space and doing this work for the first time, we were seeing so many, those that had never been a part of the conversation before, now being willing to engage. And I can remember celebrating that, one, but also recognizing that this ship will sail. This will pass, and then everyone will go back to business as usual, and really wishing that that were not the case. But it's that thought process, that mentality that this is what we talk about for right now, do a couple of things, and then we go back.
You know, what's so painful for me as a Black woman is that this work, or this hot topic, as it was referred to, is my life. It is the fight of my life. It is the fight of my people, my history. It has never been a hot topic for me and the people that look like me, right? It has always been an issue. James Baldwin has a quote that people are trapped in history and history is trapped in them. And my history is different from some of the histories that I clearly have been taught and many people have been taught, and how people have lived their lives. And my history is one of oppression. My history and experience is one of segregation, one of a fight. And to hear someone trivialize DEI work as a hot topic when it is the topic, the main fight that I engage in consciously and unconsciously every day, is the very example of privilege. What a privilege it is for you to decide that you want to engage in the work or not, to say, oh, this is the hot topic. And what we know about hot topics historically is that they're only hot for a moment. And then once the fever dies down, it's totally forgotten. I don't want to forget. I don't want this topic, the way that I live my life, my existence, the existence of my children, to go away. It's about systems. It's about beliefs. It's about laws. It's about practices. It's about so much more. And I resent anyone referring to the oppression that I fight against every day as a hot topic.
So I'll jump in on that one. When I start looking at this conversation around DEI, and I have been engaged in this work in some way, form, shape, or fashion since the early 90s easily. And I took it and started it from a historical point of view, from an economics point of view. That's my original educational background. And I'm reminded, I'm gonna read it verbatim so I don't mess it up. Dr. Martin Luther King's quote, everybody knows I have a dream.
Right.
I've been to the mountaintop. I may not make it there with you. It may be true that the law cannot make a man love me, but it can keep him from lynching me. And I think that's pretty important too. And when we start having these conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, it has left some of my counterparts offended and taken aback and aggressive in their offenses because of their lack of understanding and education. In some people's perspectives, but in others, I think they know. And that's part of the reason why they fight so hard and so viciously also. So the conversation, for instance, around critical race theory and these thoughts about where we are as a nation and how does this include with diversity? You know, I could be diversity and include, but I don't want to talk about CRT. Well, I can talk about your thoughts, your emotions, your will, your mind for a minute. But what I love about the original work that I started with was looking at the foundation of our democracy. And that, understand the history, Dr. Walker, you kept going back to the history piece. We don't teach enough history to be able to deconstruct how we got to where we are and watch it happen over and over again. You know, we're doomed to repeat history if we don't know it. So we look at this conversation around our Constitution, for instance. That is the fabric and the framework of our democracy as we know it. And we are divided at the federal, the state, and the local level into executive, legislative, and judicial branches. At some point in time, when all of our institutions start working with this DEI work, we've got to go back to where in the frameworks of our institutions are the inequities embedded and sustained. So when people, oh, it's in the fabric of our democracy, racism is in the fabric of our democracy, it offends people. But if we take our democracy and the fabric that it is built upon as our Constitution, and our Constitution lays out judicial, legislative, and executive, we've got to go back and say, what was legislated and put into law? What did the judicial branch uphold? And what did they put in their opinions and their appeals? And what does the executive branch act on? That's a totally different conversation on whether or not, okay, I like you or I don't like you. How did that piece from a legislative, judicial, and executive part come back into and do our policies, procedures, and our processes in the institutions that we operate under. So, and then you start to really understand why people are so vicious with opening up the right to vote to everybody, because that vote sets the law. That vote puts those judges in place. That vote puts the executive branch in place to set up the rest of our institutions and what we get to do. And we can come back and visit some real life examples of that. But, and I'm particularly interested right now, what happened right after the Civil War and all that was undone from the Reconstruction. You see the tentacles of it even today. So our DEI work, there's the piece, there's the bias and the understanding, and the process, the procedures, and our policies. What are we doing to operationalize our ignorance?
You know, James Baldwin has another quote that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And the hard part of accepting the challenge, because we challenge our brothers and sisters, we challenge our colleagues, our counterparts to learn about their history so that they can understand the reasons behind it. Like, there are reasons why African Americans have, 30 cents to the dollar when you compare wealth between whites and blacks, and that statistic might be off some, but there's a reason. And so we've gotta, like Dr. Neville said, peel back the layers and understand that when we talk about fabric, we're not talking about a piece of clothing. We are talking about the very laws, the policies, the procedures that were put in place to keep people in place.
What's interesting about that for me too is not just when you think about the laws, but when you think about the systems within the framework of where we operate, our jobs, our everyday lives. I think all of those things, again, are in the fabric of everything. Those systems have been put into place intentionally, right? And so we continue to work within that. I know within my industry, it is very much intentionally segregated. And when I look at the access that other people that look like me have compared to my counterparts, it is very intentional. So when you talk about the ability to make the same amount of income, it's very, it is very intentional. So I think that's one of the big parts about learning is understanding that it's been created intentionally.
Yeah, I think one thing that I always like to say to people is, you got to peel that onion all the way back, right? Most people don't, they just want to chop off that first little piece and peel it all the way back to the core, right? So that we can figure out, because, when you hear people say things like, well, I never owned a slave, or, nobody in my family that I know ever owned a slave, or you were never a slave. When you hear that, that's when you start thinking, oh dear, we got to peel that onion all the way back so that we can understand why there is such a disparity between Black wealth and white wealth, or why we can then understand why you might live in a really nice neighborhood, but there may only be 3 other families that look like you in a neighborhood of 400 or 500 families. That's not by happenstance. There are reasons for all that. And that is why the DEI work is so important, because we want people to understand, know the history, right? So that we can figure out the best way to proceed forward. Because you can't say, oh, there's no more this or that. That's all in the past. That's all done. Why we can't just start from here? Well, I wish it was that easy to just start from here. But is it?
No. And the reason why we can't start from here is because of the generational wealth that Black people have been denied. So when we go back to the Civil War, and when slaves were freed and reparations were paid to the white slave owners and land was given to the slave owners, and we know that wealth is based on land ownership, right? And then we also know that there were laws written that prevented slaves, from owning land, right? So we know those types of things because that is the history. It's part of the history, but you don't know what you don't know. So as an educator, what I know is that our history books omit so much of that history. And that in order for you to really know the reality of why we live the way that we live, you've got to educate yourself. You have to put yourself in a position where you learn about redlining. And some of you are going to think to yourself, what is redlining? Redlining is a practice where banks would only give loans to certain individuals, right? So when you think about neighborhoods, the wealthier neighborhoods versus the poor neighborhoods, think about who lives in those neighborhoods, right? Banks won't give loans. It was illegal. They made it illegal for certain families to buy land in a certain neighborhood, right? So we're talking about neighborhood associations, right? So there are intentional practices that have kept whites and blacks segregated and separated. When we talk about the school system, what do we know about the school system? Well, you may not know what redlining is, but you gotta have an understanding that wealthier neighborhoods fund their schools differently because there's money. So we talk about property taxes, local finances are what predominantly supports a school system. So in urban areas where you have a lot of high rental properties, low income housing, period, how are those, what do those property taxes look like? Well, I can promise you that they're not the same as a housing, a neighborhood that houses $500,000 homes.
Or if you want to take it down another step, what do the PTAs look like to supplement those budgets?
Yep.
Who gets to bring in their fundraisers and how do they fundraise on behalf of the school? So there is always that conversation. And then you go back and you put somebody, I'm gonna put Nikki on the spot. You say, hey, come into healthcare, help us. Where do you start to eat the elephant?
I think we have to recognize it's an elephant first.
First.
And recognize that it's bigger. It's bigger than Nikki. It's bigger than one department. So part of what I've been educating, if we go there, our leaders on is it's not just one person's responsibility. Again, because it's not a hot topic, and it can't just be put in one department, right? It's the responsibility of all of us. Right. So we need to be, if we're looking at patient care, we need to be looking at it through a DEI lens. We have to look at quality through a DEI lens, safety through a DEI lens. Like each and every one of us has a responsibility in this work. And so going back to a couple of points that were made, Melita bring up, the James Baldwin quote when we're talking about, I just lost it. But anywho, when we're talking about the change, right? And then even, can we just start here? There we go. It's Monday, friends, for us recording. When we're talking about that, we have to go back to the history. That's why it's so important to have that background, that understanding. And for so often we hear, well, can't we just start from here? And that's because our history is traumatic. Our history is dark. Our history is all of those things that we don't want to face because they don't feel good. But if we don't, then we can be skewed in our thought process about what is going to work and what will not. And I can't remember. So when we're talking about like critical race theory and all of the things, the legislation and all of the things that people are really up in arms about, as far as we can't teach this to our kids, and we don't want to face that. But I don't remember anyone asking my mother as a parent, is it okay if we eliminate this part of the history because we just think that kids shouldn't learn too much about this or that. And I don't, as a parent, I don't remember anyone asking me if it was okay to eliminate all the parts of the history that don't feel good. I don't remember that. No one considered the Black and Brown experience and how we teach history. No one considered it as a part of what is going to make these kids whole. And I'm always transparent about how the history rooted in trauma without being provided examples of those leaders that I could aspire to outside of the very skewed perspectives of what they wanted to teach me about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and civil rights and how that impacted me as an adult.
Yeah.
So we can't just pick and choose what parts we're going to retell, put a feel-good lens on to make it feel good. And all of those things, we can't start from here because even though slavery, I always recommend the institution of slavery, I always recommend that people watch Ava DuVernay's 13 on Netflix to at least get an idea of how laws were created, how it was intentional in the practices to tear apart Black households, how like all the things that we're talking about, the legislation put in place to put people in certain places. Like this was done intentionally. And we have to understand that. So we can't just say, hey, can you come and help us with our DEI work? And we come and we're just going to talk about all the things that, well, we celebrate our differences, and we do. Like we have those conversations about what is diversity, what is equity, what is inclusion. Like we have to be on the same page as far as terminology. But if you're really serious about the work and you understand that it's not just something we check off for this day and then we're all good and we go to this event and we're good for at least 365. It doesn't work that way. Like we have to be really invested in understanding why policies that were created back in the inception of an organization were created in the way they were. It's very likely that populations or people were intentionally left out, intentionally. And you have to be willing to face that and do that work. And a lot of times we don't want to do that because that requires that we give up something. And really, the most important part of that is our comfort. Like you have to realize that, yes, it's working in your favor, but look at all of those people over there that it's not working for because of the way it was designed. So you have to be willing to like acknowledge, yeah, I'm all in because it works to the benefit of me.
And that's empathy, that's compassion. And when we talk about this work being relational, it's really about being able to relate to another person and understand the lived experiences of another person and validate and acknowledge the lived experiences of a person that is different from you. And so I have another James Baldwin quote. He said, I imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hate so stubbornly is because they sense that once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with the pain. And I have some very painful experiences. And what I know as a Black woman is that it is rooted in the policies, the procedures, the beliefs, the understandings, and the practices of some people, right? And the fact that I have experienced this pain, I know how painful it is, and I wouldn't want anyone else to experience that pain. And so I understand why some people don't want to go down this road because it's a painful road. I mean, think about the miniseries North and South back in the 80s. When we think about The Color Purple, when we think about Roots, you know, all of these slave narratives that are so painful to watch because of the trauma. And what we know is that even though they are historical depictions, we know that it's rooted in historical accuracy.
I can give you
And-
an example really quick to kind of run that up. I remember J. Marion Sims and the controversies around him. He's the considered the founder of gynecology, and that his work was done on enslaved African women that he experimented on without any anesthetic, and did horrible, horrible things to Black female bodies in the name of science. And what he also came up, and it was predicated on that women, Black women didn't feel pain.
Right.
So so go look at the history. So you had people that were out on the East Coast mad because they were taking a statue down at one of the universities. But that work that he started out about pain, and this is physical, Dr. Walker, this is not going into the psychological trauma that's coming out, physical pain. You could still see medical books written that talked about Black women and Black people not feeling the same amount of pain in the same way as their white counterparts. And those books were in the 20th and 21st century. It wasn't yesteryear. Books in use now. And how do you pay that forward? I remember going to the ER in some of the worst pain I've ever been in my life. And that ER doctor treated me like I was a drug fiend trying to get drugs to feed my habit, not recognizing that there was physical pain actually in my body based off of the fact that I had an injury to my spine, a nerve in between C5 and C6. But the issue was history. Can't we just forget about it? No, J. Marion Sims laid a foundation in what pain management looks like for Black female bodies in particular, that laid and birthed a whole line of medicine that fed into that doctor's experience when he read in the medical book that told him, oh, Black women don't feel pain anyway, that played out in the 21st century when I went to the ER.
And not only that, but think about the numbers of doctors that practiced with that understanding, right? And so the implications of that misinformation, right? And what we're talking about when we mention omitting historical facts is misinformation, and it's intentional. And so when you don't acknowledge that there's an issue, you can't fix the issue. Most recently, the NFL decided that that there was a lawsuit. Former Black NFL players sued the NFL because they decided that with the brain trauma, that the intellectual capacity of Black NFL players was less than that of their white counterparts. And so they paid them less money because based on those doctors, their understanding is that Blacks and whites, they just don't have the same intellectual capacity. So we're going to pay the white man more because according to what we believe, right? What we believe is that these guys are different from these guys. We value these guys more. So we're going to pay them more.
Can I real quick?
And it doesn't make sense.
Real quick, I just want to, because that is bringing that NFL case, we've looked into that, just looking at, I just want to give a shout out, right? I want to say kudos and give you an example of why this work is important and how you have to go to the beginnings to get a true understanding. You cannot skip steps. So I am proud of, and I don't even know if I've shared this with you ladies, but the MU School of Medicine. I am so proud of our medical students. They're doing work that shouldn't be on their shoulders. So we have some medical students in their 3rd and 4th year that are creating content and bringing up critical topics that they want to see infused in their curriculum because they see the need and want to see future physicians not doing harm, right, to populations of people that are part of the global majority, right, of people of color. And so just last week, our students presented to our 1st year medical students on their first day, the biological construct, talking about social constructions of race and going back and informing them of how race, for example, was it came up with, and looking at 3 researchers in particular, one of which changed his mind on how many races there were from like 30 to down to like 5 in a matter of just a few years. And so when we're talking about the human bodies, because people of the global majority, people of color, have not been seen as human, really, right? We haven't been seen as human. So if we're talking about future physicians, and this is what they're being taught, or this is information that has been eliminated in their schooling, how are they supposed to operate? Even in their defense, they're walking around in the fog, only being given the information that is fed to them. So I am, while we have work to do still, lots, I applaud the willingness of these students who, again, it shouldn't be in their wheelhouse. They should just be able to be there and learn. But pushing us, pushing the faculty and staff to look more critically at how we're educating future physicians based on, but this is the critical point, you couldn't eliminate what has been taught or shared historically.
Right.
That history is informing how we operate going forward. And that is how this DEI works. It has to work that way.
Yeah. And I say again, just quickly, like I'm thinking about Nikki in healthcare, right? I'm thinking about Dr. Walker and Dr. Neville in education. I'm thinking about Crystal in the beauty industry. I'm thinking about myself in, the events and fundraising industry. And so I can see in each one of these industries how this work is so critical, right? We know how it's critical in healthcare. We definitely understand how it's critical in education, because what have our kids been taught historically, or what are they being taught now? In the beauty industry, and Crystal, I'll let you speak to that yourself. We know that salons are typically super segregated places, probably about as segregated as church. I bet it's probably neck and neck. And in event spaces and in these fundraising spaces and these social circles, when you look around at these events, who are you looking around at? Who are you looking at? Does everybody in that room look exactly like you, right? Or have you ever considered, when you're in these spaces, if you do look around and you might see 1 or 2 people who may not look like you, have you ever stopped to consider, how must those people feel? Because how would you feel if the tables were turned? And so this work, as I said in the introduction, is not easy, but it is necessary.
And I think
I think that I'll just say that puts it in perspective, and why it's not just you. They talk about the iceberg, and that the little piece that you see above the water is just the little tip. That's the tip of the iceberg. But it's the rest of it underneath the water that's really holding that tip up, that when you sit and you start to address, I think that's why we looked at the tape, looked across the table when it was the hot topic. We kind of looked like, huh? You're up here on the tippy top of the iceberg. And that just, in that one statement, showed that you didn't realize how much was underneath the water. So
well, privileged enough not to have to.
And when you think about the demographics of that room at that moment, supported, and everybody else was like, oh yeah, it's a hot topic. We'll get over this. We'll get over this soon.
We'll get over it.
We'll get over it. We'll keep pushing through. It'll be gone soon, so we can get back to business as usual.
Regular life. How many years have we been trying to get over? Think about the Negro spirituals. When I get over, if we could have changed this, it would have been changed. Right? The revolts of slaves, Harriet Tubman, right? Fast forward to all those educational laws, Plessy, Brown, right? Civil rights movement, voting rights, right? If we could have changed it, it would have been changed by now. But
Oh, we
It
did.
is,
And when we
there have
did,
been some
we were met with such vicious violence.
resistance, and the
Violence.
resistance, right? Violence and resistance, and that violence and resistance was about resisting change, right? Resisting access, resisting resources, resisting that. I don't understand, and I teach my kids, we all have biases, right? Nikki, you say if you have a brain, a working brain, you have a bias.
Right.
It's
All of
the
it.
messages intended and unintended. Crystal can speak to the unintended messages in magazines when you don't see someone who looks like you in a magazine. Think about when we were children, the Cosby Show was the only positive show that depicted an African-American family that kind of looks like my family and how we grew up. That's what I knew, but that's not what we saw predominantly, right? And Asian Americans can have the same conversation, Hispanic Americans,
Yes.
any ethnic group can have the same conversation, because that's not what we see on TV. That's not celebrated, that's not supported, which is why that lady stood up and said, this is the hot topic, because it's optional for them, right? It's optional to take this on or to focus on this or not. And now, because it's become an international issue, and we're talking about the treatment of people, right? How you treat people, right? My hope for you is that you live a good life, that you have access to the same things, right? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about equity, right? We're talking about how are you including me? I don't just want to be in the room. I want my voice to be heard. I want my perspective to be respected. I want to be considered, right? So when we talk about DEI work, we're just not talking about, hey, your color skin is this, and you're a female, or you're able-bodied, or no, that's not. We're talking about how people are treated, what access and resources look like for those people, and the barriers put in place that creates that inequity. That's what we're talking about.
Absolutely.
I agree. We got to get off the surface, people. At some point, got to get off the surface.
Everyone is responsible. Nikki said that. We all have a part to play in this. We have a part in our own education and re-education. You walk in a room and you start a statement that said in 1492, Columbus. What did George Washington chop down? That cherry tree.
Cherry tree.
And so if you can go back and come up with those little colloquialisms that we've created to make history cute, then we can also start to unpack and give the same knowledge and understandings of our democracy is formed. I mean, I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Let's talk about that bill and the importance of it and what happens to it after it goes back and forth. What it means to my life is not just paper. It's an action. We can redo this and reteach this. And it's a real hard thing for adults in particular, because you start looking at how do you reteach and rethink and rework with adults. That adult education or re-education piece is a challenge. And that's when you start looking at those emotional responses to interrogating where they are or how I got here. I got here by hard work. Okay. I got here because I deserve it. Okay. If I work, it's not about, are there any other policies and procedures that made your work exponentially better off or more productive than my work? Yes. Tomorrow is Black Equity payday, because it took African-American females the extra 8 months of a year to go back and make the same amount of money as their white male counterparts. But we worked. Nikki worked. I know Crystal worked. I know Melita worked. I know Adonica worked. I know, because we're in the middle of the night texting each other talking about, you still working? Yes, we still working. So it wasn't about the work. There are the policies, processes and procedures in place that make my work not get paid the same amount as my counterparts' work, or let them start their work in their 30s and let me start mine in my 40s.
And then let's go even deeper to the people who created those and what their beliefs are. So if you are a resident or the highest doctor, and you were taught, right, that Black people have an intellectual capacity that is beneath those of white people, what are your practices like? From generation to generation, what have you taught the generations that come after you? And how have you continued to perpetuate those inequities and those inaccuracies, right? And so when we talk about educating yourselves and really understanding the truth, we're talking about the 1619 Project. We're talking about that historical perspective from a different lens. We're talking about the history that was omitted from the textbooks that were written by white men, right? We talk about who writes those textbooks. Traditionally, it's been white men. When we talk about who is writing bills, who's passing these laws, it's historically white men. And so when you challenge what they know and believe to be true, you're challenging their grandfather, their great-grandfather, their great-great-great-grandfather. You're challenging this Constitution that they claim is so important to them, right? It's important when it's able to uphold the way that you live your life and how you support generations of generations of generations that will come after you, right? I want the same. I want the same for my kids. I want that same expectation. I want them to be able to buy a house anywhere they want. I want them to be able to get equal pay for the same kind of work. I want people to recognize their intellectual capacity is the same and that they should be valued the same, but it's historical and it's in our DNA. And we have to acknowledge that. And that's the part where we are struggling the most right now with this resistance to what is CRT. That's law, right? How many of us really know law and study the laws, right? And so you have these scholars who have broken it down so that we can understand it better using layman's terms. That is what CRT is. It talks about the systems and structures that were put in place to oppress people. But there's a group of people that don't want us to know about that. Why? Why? What are you resisting? It's about resisting the opportunities to make things equitable and better for all people. Again, you're resisting how we treat people better. When you talk about anti, and I've been on this and I'm preparing for back to school and all of that, and I am going to stop using the word anti, and I'm going to start using the word against. And I know that they're synonyms, they mean the same thing. But sometimes when you say anti-racism, people get up in arms. I challenge you to get up in arms if I say against racism. Are you against it? Right? So it's also the language that we use that's polarizing, right? It's not polarizing to me because I get it. It's the same. But if you tell me that you are not anti-racist, I'm looking at you like, why not? Right? But if you say I'm against anti-racist teaching, then for some reason you think you got me on something. It just means against. So you're against us teaching about inequities. You're against us teaching each other how to treat each other's children better as educators. You're against systems that make it equitable for people to have access and treatment and resources and money. You're against me living a more fruitful, better life? Or are you just anti?
All right. Question of the day. Question of the day. Well, Crystal, go ahead before I.
Oh, I think Melita covered it. One of the big things I just wanted to talk about is I know one of the big things that I push, especially in my space, that this is an active practice and this is a lifelong journey, right? Again, we're not going to check a box. It's not a hot topic. And this is not something that's going to change today, tomorrow, or even this year in the next 365. It is literally something that will take us a lifetime, our kids a lifetime, because it didn't happen overnight. When we look at the history of how long and the systems that have been put into place to get here, realizing that this is not a hot topic, and this is something that is a life learned active practice that we all have to participate and be willing to discuss and be a part of.
Agree.
I just, before we close, I'd just like to say, like, if any part of this conversation made you uncomfortable, or if there was any part where you were like, oh my gosh, like, I wonder if I've said this is a hot topic, or all that, and now you're feeling convicted, or I'm a little turned off, that's okay. That's a good place to be in, because that's where we do our best work in our discomfort. And there's really nothing about DEI work that is especially comfortable for anyone involved, us talking about it, you receiving it, but it's necessary, right? So we have to have a willingness to understand our history. History, friends, is a big part of why we are where we are today. That's not a step you can skip. Just to talk about how can we celebrate the foods that you like to eat, and the way you like to dress, and the music you like to listen to. It's so much more than that. So if that's where you're at, that's on that surface. That's the tip of the iceberg, right? It has nothing to do with the whole human. And we're talking about human beings here. And so ask yourself, like, what part brings you the most discomfort? And I challenge you to begin there. And don't ever think that this is something that you do a couple of things and you're done. This is continuous. Our learning, even as Black women, is continuous. In our respective spaces, we learn and share resources with each other, but you're never going to reach a destination in this work and just say I've arrived. And if that's where you're at, you're wrong. We just say, no, it doesn't work like that. But I encourage you to understand, like, DEI work is more than one workshop about differences. It's more than just going through and getting an understanding of implicit biases. It's so much more. And I challenge you to do the work.
And I also want to mention that as people of color, we also have work that we have to do to understand some of the biases that we possess in our own lives, in our own thinking. I was having a conversation with my sisters about ancestral DNA, like Iyanla Van Zant talks about the ancestral DNA and the things that we are taught and the things that we grow up with, the ideas that we grow up with, the messages that are shared from generation to generation. And the example we used was the dogs, right? Like, my mother has an irrational fear of dogs. She's never been bitten by a dog. She's never been attacked by a dog, but her grandmother told her to stay away from dogs, that dogs are vicious. And why? Because in her experience, dogs were vicious, right? They were unleashed on people, right? When we talk about swimming, like, historically, why don't Black people know how to swim? It's not like that fear of water, that fear of drowning has something to do with our DNA. It has something to do with the experiences and histories of our ancestors and the messages that we have been taught. It is in us. And we have to really educate ourselves, because not knowing where those generational patterns come from, then we are doomed to repeat those patterns. It is so dangerous right now and relevant to COVID. And I was watching the news the other day, and they were talking about the Tuskegee Airmen and the syphilis, and the narrative from generations has been that the government was giving syphilis to Black men. So they were injecting syphilis into them, right? And that the COVID shot, the government is actually giving you something, right? Well, the real history of it was that these men had syphilis, and there was medication to treat them, and that medication was withheld from them, right? And that's history that I recently heard, right? And so the story that was told to me from generation to generation to generation, even in like the media and the public, like if you get on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, you'll hear people say, well, my grandmother told me about the Tuskegee men, the airmen, and how they gave them syphilis, and you can't trust doctors. And that's generational, but it's also inaccurate. And so there are so many inaccuracies in history and so much learning that we all need to do. And I don't want any of our counterparts to feel like, oh, you're saying that I'm the only one who has to do this work and we need to. No. The same history that was omitted in your history book is the same history that was omitted in mine. And why? Because I went to the same high school. I went to a high school that was just like yours, right? I had the same standards, the same curriculum. I had the same white teachers that you had. Those teachers were educated just like your teachers were educated. You don't know what you don't know. Right. And so part of that challenge too, you have to understand the historical accuracies and inaccuracies. And you've got to be willing to accept that there's a different perspective and that your truth is not my truth.
So to jump on, to kind of go piggyback off of that, I would suggest one of those steps as we move forward is to read, to watch, and to research. I hear a lot of conversations around things that people say, oh, you can't use this. I'll pick 1619 right now. Haven't listened to the podcast, haven't read the document, have not looked at any of the primary source documents that Nicole Hannah-Jones used to support that piece. Read, watch, and research. We're at a time in history where we have access to more knowledge in this little flippy phone over here than we have ever had since time began. We have primary source documents. Somebody says something, oh, Abraham Lincoln didn't free the slaves. Well, okay, we can unpack that. Abraham Lincoln said himself, he would have done anything to preserve the Union, including allowing the South to keep those enslaved Africans if they would have stayed in the Union. Those are quotes out of speeches. That's not me throwing out information on him or miswriting or misrepresenting what he said. Those are in his speeches. We have the opportunity now to podcast. We have the history books, and we have those pieces of information available to us. So especially at this time when we start having that piece around, oh, you can't trust this. And one of the speakers down at Jeff City talked about a socialistic text written by Howard Zinn, A People's History. And they did another book, A Young People's History. Well, they missed the fact that he also has a companion guide that is the primary source document called Voices, because the history books are written off of the primary source documents. So we have the opportunity. Read, watch. Nikki referenced, I think it was 13. Was that you?
13. Ava
13.
DuVernay.
Watch. There are all kind of documentaries out. Roots is a history in and of itself, but go and dig up Eyes on the Prize 1 and 2. There are things that you can go and see and then research. That way, when you come to the conversation saying what you hate, you can go and reference the documentation and not somebody else's interpretation for you.
Exactly. Primary documents. So before we close, I just want to share that about a month ago, Nikki and I were asked to present a very short session on DEI for local organizations, one of their breakout sessions. And so last week, I received a card in the mail that came from one of the gentlemen who attended. And I think this is just a good way to wrap up. He said, this card is a thank you for the presentation you co-hosted at the organizational retreat. DEI has so many complexities and dynamics that it definitely deserved more time. I don't think a month of 1-hour sessions would be enough time to reach any one person's understanding, acceptance, or responsibility to make relative change. I could go on forever. However, I wanted to thank you both. So when I got that, totally unexpected, from a white man who attended our session. I thought, what a great way to sum it up. It's a lifelong learning endeavor, and I believe it should be treated as such. So, ladies, thank you. We are the Collective Counsel once again, and thank you so much for attending our session.
Thank you.